tea spilled first, not from a careless hand, but from a man whose spine had always been straight as a verdict. Grandfather Arthur, still dressed in his Sunday best though it was Thursday afternoon, crumpled in slow motion beside the hearth, like a keystone finally giving way in an old cathedral. The porcelain cup shattered. Yes. But it was the silence after that made the moment echo. I watched it unfold through the haze of late sunlight piercing the lace curtains, the steam still curling from the broken cup like breath escaping a wound. No one moved. Not father. Not mother. Not me. We were a family so well trained in composure that even collapse had to follow protocol. And yet, something in me shifted. Not panic. Not grief. But a stillness so deep it felt like recognition. They say the Albright family is a monument, something built from tradition, carved in legacy, reinforced by reputation. My father, Jonathan, is the architect of that myth, a man who could silence a courtroom with one word, who polished truth until it gleamed like marble. My mother, Evelyn, curated perfection with the grace of a museum director. Every dinner, every smile, every silence arranged like an exhibit. And then there was Ben, my uncle, my accidental mirror. He stood at the edge of every family photograph like a misplaced shadow, unshaven, undone, and seemingly unbothered by the script we all followed. He didn't belong in the blueprint. And yet somehow, he made the margins feel warmer and more alive. I used to think he was the exception, never realizing that exceptions sometimes rewrite the rule. As for me, I was the promise. The firstborn heir of a legacy no one asked me if I wanted. A licensed architect by 27, a finalist in the New England Design Awards, a name whispered in rooms I hadn't even entered yet. I lived by clean lines, sharp angles, and a devotion to structural integrity both in buildings and blood. But that day, the ground shifted beneath us. Grandfather's collapse wasn't just medical, it was metaphorical. In a family that valued control, illness was an insult to the order, a breach in the narrative. The diagnosis came hours later, a rare bone marrow failure, the kind that doesn't forgive time, the kind that demands a donor with matching bloodlines. I remember Father's jaw tightening, not in fear, but in calculation, as if bracing for litigation. I remember Evelyn's hands trembling beneath her rings, but only when she thought no one looked close enough to see. Ben said nothing. He only stared at the spilled tea, as though it foretold something none of us were ready to name. It was then I offered to be tested, not out of duty, but out of love, or maybe guilt for being born into a story I didn't write. They agreed. Father, reluctantly. Ben, with a pause too long to be meaningless. They say DNA tests are just science, but they forget that sometimes. Science reveals secrets that memory buried. We thought we were saving a patriarch. We didn't know we were about to unearth the foundation's fault line. And I, so certain of who I was, so proud of my place in this grand design, was about to discover that blueprints can lie. Hope, in our household, had always worn a suit. It never begged. It never trembled. It presented itself as a logical step, a curated response, something to be managed and measured, never something to feel. But when the doctors explained that no immediate family member was a match, and that time was an unforgiving current, I saw, for the first time, a tremor in Father's voice. Just a fraction of a second, but enough to tell me that hope had slipped past protocol. They spoke of marrow registries, of expanded tests, of casting a wider genetic net. It was clinical, orderly, detached, until it wasn't. Until the words family lineage, recessive alleles, and non-parental events began to cloud the sterile air with something that felt less like science and more like confession. It wasn't about just blood anymore. It was about whose blood ran in which direction, and what truths lay curled at its root. I volunteered first, not because I am noble, or brave, or even particularly generous, but because I couldn't bear the idea of grandfather slipping through our fingers like steam through those cracked porcelain shards. He was the only man who ever looked me in the eye and said I reminded him of someone who mattered, not because of pedigree, but because of fire that did not need a name. So I gave my sample, watching the lab nurse label the vial as if sealing a piece of me inside glass. I signed consent forms I didn't fully read, scanned waivers with words like secondary results and familial anomaly that barely registered beneath the noise in my chest. I didn't care if there was a way to anchor him back to life. I'd offer every cell I carried. Father agreed. Of course, not because he feared loss, but because he hated uncertainty. For him, a diagnosis was a problem to be solved, a breach in the contract of order that needed swift, clinical repair. He bled for this test with the same resignation he might sign a merger, necessary, unpleasant, but ultimately forgettable in the paperwork of legacy. Ben hesitated, not dramatically. And he didn't make a scene, but I saw it clearly. A flicker in his eyes, a stillness in his limbs. Something stilled too long to be coincidence. He asked one question, barely above a whisper. Is it deep testing? And when I nodded, he closed his eyes for a beat too long, then simply said, All right then. I didn't understand then, but I would, soon enough to wish I didn't. The days after felt hollow, like living inside scaffolding. Work continued. I submitted plans, held meetings, answered emails, but it all rang tinny and false in the high ceilings of my own expectations. I was drawing buildings I couldn't feel, pitching facades while mine began to crack in places I couldn't name. Evenings were worse. The house grew quieter, as if holding its breath around us. Father buried himself in legal briefs. Evelyn rearranged flowers no one would see bloom. And Ben? Ben sat outside on the porch, lit only by the amber of his cigarette, as though he were waiting for something to come undone without him moving a muscle. That week, Evelyn made tea she didn't drink, poured it, stirred it, let it go cold on the counter beside untouched napkins, and one evening, as we passed in the hallway, she said, so softly I almost missed it, Some truths don't stay buried just because we don't speak them. Then she kept walking, as though she hadn't spoken at all, but the words clung to the air like dust in old light, and I inhaled them before I could decide not to. When the email arrived, results available, I stared at the subject line for minutes, not because I feared the answer, but because I feared the unraveling that would follow. I scheduled my appointment, closed the laptop, and sat still for an hour, hands idle, heart not. I told myself I was doing this to help grandfather. That's what everyone believed. What I didn't say was that part of me already sensed something was wrong, that I wasn't just chasing a miracle. I was standing at the threshold of a revelation, one that would not heal, one that would fracture the very beams of belief I stood upon. And still, I opened the door, knowing that whatever waited inside that room would not only change the course of our future, it would redraw the past. The days between the email and the appointment moved like fog, soft-edged, soundless, and heavy with something I couldn't quite name. I moved through them with the careful precision of someone walking across unfinished beams, aware that one misstep might shatter everything below. No one asked me what I was feeling, and I didn't offer it. In our house, silence was a kind of currency, a way to stay in control even as things spun out of reach. I worked, because that's what I'd always done when things threatened to unravel, but the lines I drew felt sterile, like I was tracing over someone else's idea of symmetry with hands that no longer believed in balance. There was a building we were pitching near the harbor, all glass and steel, sharp angles meant to reflect power and clarity. Yet every time I looked at it, all I saw was tension, an architecture of denial, holding itself upright with invisible strain that mirrored my own. Ben lingered more than usual, not in rooms, but in doorways, occupying the edges of conversations he didn't enter, hovering at the fringe of laughter like someone remembering a joke they no longer believed in. There were nights I caught him staring at the fire grate long after the embers died, as if he were searching for warmth in things long extinguished and irretrievable. Once, he passed me in the kitchen and said, "You always looked like someone who knew," then laughed, soft, bitter, and low, as if the truth had teeth he'd already tasted. Mother kept busy in her way, rearranging heirlooms, polishing frames, realigning forks that didn't need adjusting, all while preserving the image, like someone preparing a house for a visitor who would never arrive. Her hands shook when she thought no one saw, and when I asked if she was all right, she simply said, "It's just the cold." Though we both knew the heater had been running steadily all evening, filling the space with a warmth her words refused. Father barely spoke. When he did, it was in short, functional bursts, requests for updates, timelines, outcomes. Never anything more than what duty required. But I watched him one morning at the breakfast table, reading the same paragraph in the newspaper for 15 minutes, his coffee untouched, steam curling upward like smoke from something unseen and unnamed. There was a crack forming beneath his logic, but he wouldn't name it, because naming things made them real, and real things required reckoning. And then there was me, still performing, still aligning lines, still smiling in the right meetings, still answering to my name as if it belonged to someone I understood. But inside, there was a sound I couldn't quiet, a hum, low and constant, like steel under pressure just before it gives. I began to question things I had never thought to question. My laugh, my walk, the slope of my handwriting, the way I tilted my head when I listened. I stared at the mirror longer than I should have, not looking for beauty, but for familiarity, trying to recognize myself in features I suddenly suspected were borrowed, the night before the appointment. I dreamed of glass breaking, not violently, but slowly, like frost unwinding across a window with patient ruin. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and the weight of some unspoken certainty on my chest. Knowing the truth was close. I didn't know its name yet, but I felt its shape lingering in the corners of thought I hadn't dared to turn. So I dressed in quiet, unassuming clothes, the kind that wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't reflect. I walked to the clinic like someone walking to a confession, not to be forgiven, but to be unmade and maybe, somehow, rebuilt from what remained. The receptionist smiled. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and lavender, and the walls were beige and kind, as if mercy had been painted into their color. When they called my name, I stood up slowly, as if gravity had changed overnight, and everything I carried weighed more than it had yesterday. I followed the nurse down a corridor that felt too long for the building's footprint, every step echoing like a question I wasn't ready to answer. At the end of it, behind a frosted glass door, someone waited, not just with results, but with a matching set of keys to every locked room inside me I had never dared to open. I had imagined the moment would come with thunder, with shouts, with the drama of revelation. It didn't arrive with spectacle or sound, but rather with a manila envelope placed gently on the table. a waiting chair across from mine, and the quiet acknowledgement that the version of me I had lived with all my life was about to be rewritten in ink I couldn't erase. And still, I sat down. And still, I listened. Because I knew silence would no longer protect me from the sound of truth. They didn't begin with the worst part. That's the thing about professionals. They cushion. They start with comfort, with gratitude, with statistics dressed as hope, and ease you in like warm water masking the cold underneath. They told me a donor had been found, a distant relative, near perfect match, an incredible coincidence too rare to ignore. I nodded. My breath caught somewhere between relief and foreboding, but I didn't relax, because beneath every coincidence, I've learned, there's often a design we're not ready to see. The woman across from me wore soft glasses and a cardigan the color of calm, and her voice was deliberate, gentle as rain on a window pane that knows it is not meant to break. She said there was something else in the results, a finding. She clarified, not urgent or clinical, but something undeniably relevant to the narrative I carried in my blood. Her fingers tapped a manila folder like it might open itself, like truth could escape if not handled correctly. Or worse, if handled too fast. She said the words slowly, giving me space to interrupt, though I didn't. I let them fall, one by one, like bricks forming a wall I hadn't known I was building, each syllable anchoring a truth I hadn't dared to draft. The test revealed, no biological relationship between you and the man listed as your father, Jonathan Albright. There are silences that stretch across time zones, and then there are silences that shrink the world to the width of your own ribcage and make it hard to breathe without breaking. Mine was the second kind. My breath didn't catch. It disappeared, as though it no longer belonged in a body that suddenly felt borrowed from someone else's narrative. She continued, her voice dipping into careful phrasing. We did, however, find a paternal match with someone else who submitted a sample in this test batch, Benjamin Albright. Her words carried steadiness, and though her eyes were wrapped in kindness, the sentence cracked something so fundamental I didn't feel it until later, like architecture breaking beneath its own weight. Long after the tremor has passed, I remember nodding, not because I understood, but because my neck still remembered how to move when addressed, a relic of training rather than clarity. My hands stayed still. My mouth didn't. I said something. Thank you. Maybe. Or I see. Or some placeholder phrase we use when language fails. Words without shape. Air dressed as meaning. I left the building differently than I entered. Not heavier, not lighter, but altered. Like someone had redrawn my blueprints without asking. Shifted load-bearing truths. And now every step echoed differently. The sun was still where I'd left it. The streets still full of cars and strangers. But the world had rearranged its center, and I no longer knew mine. The city moved around me, and I walked through it like scaffolding, visible, hollow, barely tethered to the sky. At one corner, I leaned against a brick wall and tried to breathe through the noise in my chest. It wasn't the kind of crying that seeks comfort, nor the kind of shock that numbs. It was recognition, quiet, sharp, familiar. The way a building knows when its foundation is no longer sound, even before the cracks appear. I didn't call anyone, didn't scream, didn't run. I just kept walking. Like if I moved far enough, I could outpace the revelation that clung to me, but it stayed with me, not like a shadow, but like a second skin woven of blood and memory. I felt Ben's name in my mouth, unfamiliar and old at once. I felt Jonathan's silence waiting back home, like a door that would not open unless I shattered it myself, inside me. The child of a perfect family was being dismantled, not by anger, nor by betrayal, but by truth with teeth. Truth that does not ask permission. Truth that redraws what love meant before it even spoke its name. I wasn't sure who I belonged to. I wasn't sure if I belonged at all. But in the core of all that fracture, one phrase took root: quiet, undeniable, steady as a heartbeat not mine. Blood doesn't build love. It simply maps its beginning and then steps aside for the rest to grow. And as I crossed the last street before home, I didn't look back, because I knew some things, once seen, cannot be unlearned. Some revelations are not endings, they are blueprints of everything that comes after. The living room had always felt like a gallery, carefully curated, framed by silence and light, where nothing moved unless permitted, and every cushion bore witness to the illusion of permanence. That day, it was different. The air trembled with a kind of expectancy, the kind that knows it has already arrived at the precipice and is only pretending not to fall. I stood in the doorway with the envelope still warm in my hand, as if heat could inscribe legitimacy onto paper, branding memory into matter. Evelyn was there, as always, immaculate in posture and porcelain in presence, a woman who had turned dignity into an art form and guilt into shadow play, so refined it could pass for grace. She saw the envelope first, then my eyes, and something ancient passed between us, older than language, heavier than breath. A recognition that needed no explanation. It wasn't the paper that undid her. It was the understanding that the veil she'd stitched for decades had finally torn. She didn't ask. Because she didn't need to. The truth had already arrived. Unspoken but unmistakable, hovering between us like a memory neither of us could deny. Her hand moved to her collarbone as if searching for a string of pearls long since removed, as though memory required a ritual gesture to surface, and her voice cracked not from disuse, but from the strain of maintaining a lie for so long it had calcified beneath the ribcage. "You found out," she said, not a question, not an apology, just the weary exhale of a truth too tired to run. I nodded, not because I forgave her, but because my body was still fluent in grief's choreography, and movement was easier than speech in the presence of unraveling. My legs carried me to the edge of the couch, where I sat as one might on the lip of a crater, still, alert, not trusting the ground beneath. She joined me slowly, her knees folding like old pages, and for the first time in years, I noticed the quiet in her breathing, the tremor that hadn't always been there, a fragile rhythm exposed. She spoke of a night without consequence that grew into decades of consequence, of a moment folded in weakness, then cemented by fear and silence, and she said it was one time, and that it became everything. Jonathan was her future, but Ben was the flame that danced once before the walls were built, before duty replaced desire. Her voice trembled less with each sentence, not because she grew stronger, but because the weight had begun to shift from her shoulders to mine. She told me the pregnancy was a calculation, a gamble dressed in silence, a secret that fed on appearances and survived by omission and repetition. They never spoke of it again. She and Ben. Because denial, she said, was the most durable form of love in a family built on image. "We buried it," she whispered, "under dinners and birthdays and Christmas trees, layering tradition over truth, like wallpaper over rot." I listened, not because I wanted to understand, but because understanding felt like the only thing left between us. And silence now felt more violent than truth. The house creaked around her confessions, as if even the walls had been holding their breath for decades. She said she loved me, that nothing about my birth had changed that. But even love felt different in a room suddenly made of ash and memory. And yet, I didn't cry, didn't accuse, didn't flee. I sat there while the woman who raised me peeled back the years and laid their brittle bones at my feet. One confession at a time. The truth wasn't violent, it was surgical, precise, necessary. A blade that cut to heal. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. What passed between us wasn't absolution, it was acknowledgement. Somewhere outside, the world continued. Cars moved, children shouted, leaves fell, and the sun made no concession for the gravity inside our walls. But inside, time bent around a revelation too heavy to measure, a moment suspended in the quiet after collapse. Evelyn had handed me not just a truth, but a legacy of silence, passed down like heirloom porcelain, beautiful, breakable, and always pretending it wasn't cracked. And as the sun slipped sideways through the blinds, slicing the room into light and apology, I knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was just the point where stories stopped being beautiful lies and started being ugly truths with the courage to stand. The house didn't collapse, but something in its symmetry did. Some hidden balance that held the Albright family in place finally gave way. Not with thunder, but with the quiet exhaustion of truth, long denied. When I showed the results to Jonathan, he didn't shout, didn't question, didn't even blink. He read the document like a contract already broken. One he had signed with hope and faith, but never with full knowledge. The silence that followed was not absence, but density, filled with the weight of things unsaid, unasked, unloved. He sat back in his chair, that old leather throne where he once recited law like scripture, and this time he didn't speak in verdicts, only in breaths, slow, fractured, deliberate. I raised you, he said, not as defense, but as anchor. And the words trembled not from anger, but from the collapse of a narrative he had lived for decades. I had never seen him look so still, not like stone, but like glass, a form that looks whole until light reveals every fault line beneath. Ben was called, not summoned like a culprit, but named like an earthquake, inevitable and overdue. He came with hands in his pockets, eyes darting between the floorboards and our faces, as though memory lived there and not in his own chest. At first, he denied nothing, but claimed little, speaking in short declarations that felt like scaffolding meant to hold up guilt without fully shouldering it. But when he looked at me, something changed. His posture softened, his eyes steadied, and he said my name, like it mattered in a world where names had begun to lose meaning. He spoke of regret not with dramatics, but with weathered honesty, of nights haunted not by what they did, but by what they chose never to undo. And he said he had loved me, not from afar, but from behind a veil woven of silence and respect, never knowing whether crossing that threshold would save or destroy us both. His voice cracked only once, when he called me his daughter, not as a claim, but as a confession wrapped in longing. And though I wanted to respond, my voice was still tangled in the distance between what I knew and what I could bear to name. The three of us in one room felt less like a triangle and more like three corners of a house split by quake lines, no longer able to meet without trembling. Jonathan didn't look at Ben, not even once, but his silence wasn't fury, it was erosion, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that withdraws, receding with every breath, leaving behind a shoreline too bare to repair. Evelyn watched from a distance, her presence like fog on glass, near, visible, but never quite touchable again, as though proximity had lost its promise, and I, in the center of it all, felt like the axis on which this quiet disaster spun, a living artifact of one choice, one night, one lie made permanent, and though I tried to hold still, everything inside me was already in motion. I wasn't angry, nor was I forgiving, nor was I able to find the vocabulary for either. I was just there, holding the weight of a name passed down like inheritance, now fractured into question, into pause, into something less certain than silence. The house still stood, but the family that filled it now echoed differently, as though every room remembered something we couldn't unlearn and no longer knew how to carry. Even the air between us was sharp, not from cold, but from recognition that we were now a family not built on blood, nor on truth, but on the shards of both, each piece reflecting a different failure we no longer had the energy to deny. And as the clock ticked its way past old rituals and into something uncharted, we sat there, not in reconciliation, but in reckoning, not seeking unity, but bracing against further fracture. In that room, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of structures folding inward, slowly, precisely, as though even grief knew how to bow beneath the architecture of betrayal. Nothing broke that night, but everything shifted, and the shift was permanent, etched into the corners of a home no longer capable of pretending it was whole. And we felt it, each in our own separate, silent collapse, each heart bearing a different version of the same unbearable blueprint, truth laid bare, love redefined, and family unmended. I didn't write him, not because I lacked the words, but because no arrangement of syllables could soften what had already cracked beyond repair. The days after felt like walking barefoot across shattered glass. Every step toward either of them left me more uncertain of where I began and who I belonged to. Ben called once, and I didn't answer, though I watched the screen light up with his name, the same way his presence used to hover at the edge of family photos, always there, but never fully inside the frame. I wanted to ask him everything, about his past, about why he chose silence, about what part of me reminded him of himself, but I couldn't bring myself to cross that fragile line between curiosity and collapse. Instead, I met him quietly, not with confrontation, but with the tremor of someone approaching a door she wasn't sure she wanted opened. We sat on a park bench, beneath trees too old to judge, and I asked him who he was before all of this. He spoke of cities, of photographs that never made it to albums, of women whose names he barely remembered, of dreams he traded for detours, and somehow, through the fog of discomfort, I saw him not as the architect of betrayal, but as a man haunted by a blueprint he never meant to draft. But that didn't mean I understood or forgave. It only meant I could finally see the man. Not the myth, not the uncle, not the father, not the echo in family gatherings, but the flawed, fragile self who once made a choice that changed the trajectory of everyone's life. And that made it harder, not easier. At work, I couldn't focus, as drafts blurred into abstractions and measurements felt meaningless. What use is symmetry when the axis of your life no longer holds? Every project became a metaphor for the instability within, a wall too thin, a column slightly off-center, a foundation unsure of what it was meant to bear. Jonathan avoided me, though I passed his study often, the door always slightly ajar, like an apology never spoken. Evelyn, meanwhile, tried to resume old rhythms, tea in the morning, light conversation about the weather, but every sentence hung with the weight of what we refused to address. And I, Ilara, once the pride of this family, had become the crack in its legacy. In those days, I wasn't angry, I was untethered, like a blueprint torn from its grid, drifting between names, histories, and truths I never asked for. And maybe that was the most painful part. Not the betrayal, not the silence, but the realization that the roots I thought ran deep were never really mine to begin with. I didn't write the letter, because what I needed wasn't on paper. It was in presence, in reckoning, in the quiet recognition of everything we were and everything we failed to be. And that silence, for now, had to be my only answer. It did not begin with forgiveness, nor with some grand act of reconciliation, but with something quieter, almost imperceptible, a chair pulled closer to the hospital bed, a glass of water placed gently on a side table, the kind of gestures too small to name but too human to ignore. My grandfather lay motionless under a veil of pale sheets, his breath a faint rhythm stitched into the silence of the room. And in that stillness, I found a place where words were not demanded, only presence. The stranger from the registry, a woman with tired eyes and a gentle posture, arrived not as a savior, but as a thread of hope stitched from a distant branch of blood. Someone whose name meant nothing but whose marrow meant everything when the match was confirmed. The air in the house shifted, not with celebration, but with a softening of the dread that had calcified our days, loosening the grip of fear that held each breath hostage. Jonathan sat beside me more often than before, not as the man of law, nor as the father of certainty, but as someone slowly relearning how to be present in discomfort, how to exist without fixing, and how to witness pain without retreating. He didn't explain or justify, instead. He simply looked at me with the kind of gaze that said, without language, that love can outlive even the truth, and somehow, that was enough for that moment to feel almost whole. Evelyn, who once performed motherhood like a symphony of manners and meals, now hovered in the kitchen with quieter hands, as though relearning each task without the armor of perfection. She didn't speak of the past, but she no longer avoided its shadow. Instead, she folded napkins slowly, poured tea with steadier fingers, as if trying to steep her regrets into something warm, tangible, and human. She touched my shoulder once, fleetingly but with weight, and that was the closest her body had come to apology. As for Ben, he didn't visit the hospital in person, at least not when anyone was watching. But I found a photograph tucked behind the monitor one morning, a snapshot of me as a toddler on his shoulders. My laughter caught mid-flight, my arms outstretched like wings. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be, because grief, after all, is not always loud. It sometimes enters a room without knocking, leaves something behind, and disappears again without demanding to be seen. My time with Arthur became a kind of vigil, hours marked not by conversation, but by care, by the quiet rituals of comfort and watchfulness. I adjusted pillows, wiped his forehead, held his hand when the machines beeped too loudly, and in those moments, when breath was the only proof of life, I remembered that family is not born, it is built, not from names or secrets, but from choosing to remain even when the foundation shakes and the past no longer fits the frame. I did not speak much, and I found that there was no need, because the house had grown quieter, not out of absence, but out of reverence for what we had lost, for what we were learning to hold again. In the hush between routines, I felt something return, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of belonging without definition, a sense that presence itself could be enough to rebuild what had been fractured, and that, in its fragile simplicity, was enough to begin again. The morning after the transplant, the hospital room held a stillness so thick it seemed to press against the windows, as though even the light itself paused in reverence. Arthur's chest rose and fell with the delicate rhythm of survival, not triumphant. but steady, each breath a quiet defiance against the odds. I sat by the window, watching the city awaken beneath a soft drizzle, and for the first time in weeks, the chaos outside felt manageable, as if the storm within me had learned to echo the rain instead of drown beneath it. Jonathan brought coffee, not out of obligation, but out of habit born again from closeness. He didn't speak much, but his silences no longer carried the weight of avoidance. They held space, an acknowledgement that healing begins in the gaps between words. We sipped slowly, side by side, like two architects tracing the lines of a blueprint that no longer needed to be perfect, just honest, just shared. Later that week, Evelyn entered the room with a book of old family photos, its leather worn, its corners softened by time. She placed it beside Arthur, who could barely open his eyes, and opened to a page where my childhood smile stretched wide across a swing in our old backyard. "You always loved to fly," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly though she held her composure. And in that moment, unforced, unpolished, was the closest thing we had to redemption. Not because it erased the past, but because it faced it without flinching. Ben called, and this time, I answered. We didn't talk about the past or the tangled roots we shared instead. He asked how Arthur was doing, and I told him, measured, honest, and unfiltered, each word deliberate and stripped of pretense. We sat in that phone call like two travelers who had crossed a storm on separate boats, now waving quietly from parallel shores, not needing to say everything, just enough. There was no forgiveness spoken, no demands made, only the soft acknowledgement that some bridges are rebuilt with silence and time. And perhaps that was its own kind of healing, in my studio. The blueprints began to change. I found myself sketching not structures of grandeur, but spaces that breathed, open courtyards, imperfect walls, asymmetrical beams that carried the weight differently and allowed for light to fall unpredictably. The paper no longer demanded symmetry. It asked for soul, and I gave it willingly. Not because I had healed completely, but because I had learned that beauty does not lie in perfection, but in persistence and presence. Arthur's strength returned slowly, each day reclaiming a little more of what illness had taken. One afternoon, he gripped my hand with a steadiness I hadn't felt in months, a small gesture heavy with meaning. He didn't speak, but his eyes told me what I needed to hear. You are still mine, not despite everything, but because of everything. And in that gaze, I felt the quiet miracle of being accepted not as a lie, nor a betrayal, but as a continuation, unexpected, but unbroken, reshaped by truth and love. The family was not the same, and perhaps never would be. Yet that no longer felt like failure. We had stopped pretending, and in that, we had found a strange sort of unity, not forged by blood alone, but by the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. We were no longer a family of legacy. We were a family of effort, of endurance, of wounds that no longer bled, but still remembered, and still mattered. And as I stood before my latest design, a structure full of glass and light and intentional scars, I knew this was not a monument to what we lost, but a testament to what we dared to salvage. The reconstruction had begun, not just in brick and beam, but in bone and breath, in silence and in word, in presence and in grace. It didn't arrive with a celebration, nor was it announced like a victory. Instead, it came in fragments, morning light warming the side of my desk, the click of graphite on tracing paper, the faint laughter of interns in the studio's shared kitchen. Life had resumed not with fanfare, but with rhythm, with a quiet cadence built from continuity. Arthur returned home in a wheelchair. Thinner, slower, but alive, and that was enough to anchor our days again. Not with the grandeur of legacy, but with the humility of endurance. My sketches shifted, no longer obsessed with grandeur or linear symmetry. I found beauty in tension, in walls that met at awkward angles but held their purpose, in hallways that invited stillness rather than awe. One of those designs, born from these imperfect lines, won a grant, small, quiet recognition, but it wasn't the prize that moved me. It was the moment I saw my name printed beneath the image of a structure with uneven floors and fractured windows that refracted light like memory. A building that breathed with its own history. Jonathan came to the exhibit opening. He stood beside me not as a curator of pride, but simply as a man looking at the life he helped build. Now standing, slightly lopsided, but standing nonetheless. We didn't speak of the past, because we didn't need to, and sometimes proximity is enough, and silence, when shared, can feel like a blessing. His presence said it all. Love endures when names fade. Evelyn arrived late, and for the first time. She didn't wear the armor of perfection. Her coat was wrinkled, her lipstick uneven, but her eyes searched mine without fear. She hugged me, an embrace neither tight nor tentative, just right in its honesty. It held no apology, only truth, the kind that lives in everyday gestures, not grand confessions. And in that moment, I understood something quietly profound. Reconciliation is not a destination, but a practice. Ben sent flowers. A note tucked between the stems read only, "For the asymmetry you made beautiful." And I kept it, not because I needed proof of connection, but because I finally understood that bloodlines do not define us, the choices we make with our truth do. We would never be a traditional father and daughter, and that, finally, was not a tragedy but a shape of its own, a silhouette formed by absence and presence alike. Back in my studio, I pinned a new sketch to the cork wall, a public library designed with overlapping beams and soft, sloping corridors, a place where people could walk into spaces that didn't demand definition. I didn't name it for my family, but I drew it from them, from Jonathan's quiet steadiness, from Evelyn's late grace, from Ben's haunting absence and strange gifts, from Arthur's stubborn breath that lingered like a thread of purpose through it all. It was, perhaps, the most honest thing I'd ever made. And on the day construction began, I stood at the edge of the lot, not in a hard hat, not giving instructions, but simply watching the machines roar to life in a chorus of motion that spoke louder than any speech. And in that sound, I felt something deeper than relief. I felt aligned, not with legacy, but with self, not with blood, but with choice. The foundation was not flawless, it was not sealed in certainty, but it was mine, staked not in what was inherited, but in what was chosen. And as the earth was carved open and redefined, I breathed, long and slow, knowing this wasn't an ending, nor even a new beginning. It was the soft middle, the steady build. The truth made structure, a new foundation, born not from what was broken, but from what refused to stay buried.